Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all again. Some of us were only left half an hour ago, but here we are again at this next session of the Supergen Hubs Joint Conference. And I'm delighted to welcome the Right Honourable Dr. Alan Whitehead to give us his perspective on renewable energy and the way forward towards our objectives around COP26 and climate change. Alan has been working in this space, as you'll have seen from his biography, for a great number of years. And one of the things that I really appreciate is when you have people who are not only well informed and intelligent, but also understand the policy background to this, because we need to bring those things together. We need to bring the policy along with the technical and the economic in order to move climate change and renewables forward. But one thing that's particularly topical at the moment, as was brought up in our last session, is hydrogen and the hydrogen economy. So that is going to be one of the key things that Alan is going to focus on for you now. So Alan, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be able to contribute to this conference this afternoon. And indeed, as you mentioned, I want to concentrate particularly on hydrogen, the hydrogen economy, but not you'll be pleased to know, a rehash of all the technical issues that I know you've been discussing this morning. But I want to concentrate rather more on how hydrogen has gone from a largely technical issue to a major political issue as far as policy development on low carbon and net zero has proceeded. And I think that's an important area to think about, because how hydrogen goes into the political space, as it were, is going to be really important in terms of whether hydrogen is used in the best way as far as getting to net zero is concerned, the right things, the right places, the right applications. Secondly, whether the thorny issue of hydrogen production will be met head on or will be dissipated. And thirdly, whether the cost issues and various other things associated with that will actually be incorporated into the general way that support is going for net zero activities within government circles. And I'm thinking here of the way that wind, for example, has been supported over a number of years with things such as the contracts for difference procedures, so that it's actually been able to deploy itself very successfully in the North Sea in particular over the period. And we see where we now stand in terms of the ambitions, which I think will certainly be realised and realisable for 40 gigawatts of new offshore wind, all low carbon, over the next decade. So those are the sort of policy area issues that we've really got to get our teeth into now as the hydrogen economy develops. And I think we ought to reflect in thinking about those policy areas just how recently hydrogen has actually come into the policy sphere. And if you look at previous energy white papers, for example, there's virtually no mention of hydrogen at all in the space in those documents, and virtually no discussion in Parliament of hydrogen. It has historically been regarded as a pretty much a sideline as far as entry into the economy is concerned. We had a fairly clear view about the role of gas, that gas had clearly replaced coal in the energy economy, and the view that gas would actually proceed to be the mainstay of the energy economy for a very long time to come. And of course, all that has changed with the path to net zero, not just the path to net zero itself, but the change from the 80% target that we had until recently, as far as climate change emission reduction was concerned, and the road to net zero that has now been firmly established. And so we're now seeing that not far from hydrogen being a very peripheral player in the energy economy of the future, it's now being suggested that by 2050, between 20 and 35% of the UK final energy consumption will arise from hydrogen. Now that's all very well to say, but of course that doesn't take account of the problems over the next stage that we've got in bringing about that level of final energy consumption and doing it in a way that actually is compatible with our net zero ambitions. And the problems clearly relate, roughly speaking, to three areas. Firstly, how do we use it? Secondly, how do we make it? And thirdly, how do we support it in its development? And I think everyone will know that the government has recently published a hydrogen strategy document, which I can honestly claim to have read. It is 126 pages, has been long anticipated, has been somewhat delayed, but the claim in the hydrogen strategy is that actually it does address a number of those particular issues in terms of the political way forward for the deployment of hydrogen in the future. What does concern me, however, is the point at which there is in that strategy, there is a departure from looking at a number of issues which I know we've all been talking about, such as what are the best areas that hydrogen can be used in, and plan those accordingly in the low carbon economy, and indeed what are the best production methods in order to feed those uses over the next period. And those particular questions have been subsumed into a general assumption that we are going to move forward in general with the hydrogen economy, that there isn't a particular clear policy divide in terms of priorities, that somehow those priorities will emerge and be dealt with, and that they will be dealt with particularly by an increase in quantum production. The target for production of hydrogen the government has set out in its strategy and also in the energy white paper is 5 gigawatts of hydrogen power into the system by 2030, but very little depiction of exactly what that 5 gigawatts is going to consist of. And indeed, probably, and I'll come back to this in a moment, a conclusion that by default, blue hydrogen in particular will take center stage in those proceedings. So I think you may have gathered that I'm not particularly impressed by the hydrogen strategy as it stands, and I do think it needs to have a lot more definition on precisely those points, what we are going to use hydrogen for and how we can produce it. Now, in terms of what we use hydrogen for, I think the principle has to be that we would use hydrogen for reaching those parts that electrification cannot easily reach. And obviously we are now in an era where it is being increasingly assumed that electrification is going to provide most of the heavy lifting in the energy sphere as far as the road to net zero is concerned. But of course, there are a number of areas where there's a big question mark against how effective the rise of electrification is going to be. And I would identify a number of areas. Firstly, heavy industry, the energy intensive industries, which are at present still largely dependent on gas and even to some extent coal for their continuing operation, need to get off that as soon as possible, and hydrogen excuse me, can play a substantial part in making that translation in a way that electrification probably can't to low carbon production methods. As far as transport is concerned, excuse me, there are clear indications that we can use hydrogen in, for example, trains, where it's not easy to electrify the lines they are on, and those trains can run very well on hydrogen. In long distance logistics, it's clearly a very long-term unlikelihood that we are going to get a large number of essentially electric trucks driving up and down the country, delivering our goods, because under those circumstances, what they would be doing is delivering some goods sat on the top of enormous batteries, which they will be hauling up and down the country in the process. And so the development of hydrogen for long-term logistics, large trucks, and also large plants such as diggers, extractors, and various other things where they would directly replace diesel seems to be an important priority. And also in substantial elements of shipping, and indeed more tantalizingly in aviation for the future. Well, there also is, of course, a substantial potential use of hydrogen in heating our homes and replacing the gas that goes into our boilers either with hydrogen or other forms of low carbon gas. But the question in all this is what priority you give to developing the supply of hydrogen that we know is going to be difficult to bring forward to those particular unless they know that they have got the supply of hydrogen behind them in order to make sure, for example, that the trains can run, the logistics can work properly, and certainly as far as aviation is concerned, that you've got guaranteed supplies when you move around. So, question of priorities appears to be at the moment with the government in terms of trying to fix the immediate and admittedly very difficult problems of heating our homes by assuming that hydrogen is going to either come in as an additive to existing gas supplies, that is a proportion of gas supplies which can be done up to 20% into our homes without actually requiring the alteration of home equipment and things such as boilers and cookers and what have you. Do reflect, of course, that town gas, before natural gas came in, consisted of between 50 and 60% of hydrogen. So this is not a particularly new issue, but it is a new issue in terms of how much of the possible supply of hydrogen is likely to be taken up by doing that, and whether that is going to start starving those other areas of the hydrogen that will be needed to develop their low carbon spheres as well. And I am rather concerned that the government appears without a clear roadmap to be suggesting that not only hydrogen will go into heating in the way I've described as a substitute for gas, but also that whole towns and cities will be converted to hydrogen completely over a period. And of course, that does mean that literally every boiler, every gas cooker has to be changed and made safe for hydrogen use. And of course, that the supplies of hydrogen have to be delivered safely in the grid. A lot of work has been done on that in terms of the development of plastic sleeving for piping, but a lot of work remains to be done. So the idea that we are going to have hydrogen towns and hydrogen cities in the not too distant future is actually rather more fraught with problems than I think the government thinks is the case at the moment. Final two things I then mention in this policy sphere is firstly the issue of transport and storage of hydrogen. Are we going to repurpose some of the gas network to deliver hydrogen? Are we going to develop new pipelines in order to deliver it? And indeed, as far as storage is concerned, that will inevitably come into the equation. Are we able to repurpose some of the present storage facilities, particularly for gas, to enable hydrogen to be stored and the reliability of source determined? And I know that British Gas, for example, have been looking at the repurposing of the rough field for storage from gas to hydrogen for the future. And the rough field stored a lot of UK gas in the past, has been closed down, could be opened up again as far as storage is concerned. But the final big question that I think is really concerning me as far as this field is concerned is the whole question of hydrogen production. And here the government appears to have decided upon effectively bringing to the very front line the development of blue hydrogen. That is hydrogen which is produced by steam methane reformation from gas and in itself is not particularly low carbon, but becomes low carbon if carbon capture and storage is attached to the process. And if carbon capture and storage is not attached to the process, attached to the process as soon as that production starts, then what you have is roughly the same level of carbon emissions that you had with gas. So you're just substituting one high carbon process with another high carbon process over the period. And certainly the early indications are that the government has decided that it wishes to prioritize blue hydrogen production. And that does make sense in certain areas where that is integrated into the industrial processes, so that you have the production of hydrogen, CCS attached to it, the use of that hydrogen nearby in industrial processes, and an integrated pipeline out to sequestration, for example, in the North Sea. But we are going to need hydrogen in places where that is not easily possible. And the concern that blue hydrogen will just turn up in the long term as grey hydrogen, I think is a very serious issue around the country outside those particular industrial clusters. So I think we need to pay very close attention to the development of green hydrogen at the earliest possible stage. The government has suggested that green hydrogen is going to be roughly price equivalent with blue hydrogen by perhaps the early 2030s, but that will only happen if the expansion of production of green hydrogen is properly supported by government, so that the savings of scale as happened with offshore wind, can be introduced into green hydrogen processes. And at the moment, there is no clear sign that that is going to happen. Green hydrogen has effectively been left to its own devices as far as its development is concerned. And that's partially, I think, a political decision based on the fact that there are a number of other things you would need to do to develop green hydrogen in a successful way. Not only provide the sort of financial underpinning, contracts for difference and various other things that I've mentioned has already been put in place as far as wind is concerned, but also the fact that you would need to substantially change the way the grid works from an electricity point of view in order to capture redundant or otherwise unused electricity, which you can then use for the production of green hydrogen without cost to the grid in the process. And there are also some rather more imaginative, some may say far-fetched ideas of using, for example, nuclear power stations that are going offline to continue their lives in the production of green hydrogen. So there are a range of other political decisions that would need to be made in order to ensure that green hydrogen was first and foremost in the frame as far as those targets are concerned, so that we really did have a genuine low carbon approach to hydrogen deployment without all the uncertainties that blue hydrogen would bring into the process. Blue hydrogen is substantially low carbon if it works properly. It is not completely low carbon, but if it is not done properly, it really is a retrograde move as far as hydrogen production is concerned. So I think I've said quite enough about the political considerations that will be coming up in the not too distant future in the hydrogen sphere, and I hope that some of what I've said will contribute to our considerations in this conference as a whole. But I just end with a view that I think there's a lot more work to be done on a hydrogen strategy before it can actually really be regarded as a proper and frontline contributor to a net zero strategy overall.
Thank you, Alan. Some thoughts there that really echoed what we had in the hydrogen and fuel cells session this morning, where there was also talk about green, grey and blue hydrogen and how these might pan out in industrial clusters in the grid, etc. So we have some questions that have come in. I'm going to start with the one from Richard in the chat, who refers back to Peter Parker's plans in the 1980s for full electrification of the train network, saying that hydrogen trains were just around the corner. Are we repeating the same mistakes of the past?
I think, yeah, I think we've got another big political with a small p problem to deal with in terms of how seriously we're going to take full electrification of the rail network for the future. And obviously that has considerable costs, and certainly as you get outside those big areas of electrification and increasing, as it were, cost benefit in terms of the development of electrification. And that's been at the heart of a lot of the stop-start nature of electrification on the rail network in the past. And of course, as we try and move more freight on to rail, we've got the problem that freight doesn't go on the same routes as passengers do in general. And therefore you will get circumstances where the freight will be traveling partly on an electrified network, partly on an unelectrified network. And therefore the default mode will be to use an unelectrified source, in this case diesel, for that freight transportation. So really the political issue is, do we proceed with the full electrification of rail with all the costs that that entails, or do we try and see whether both for freight transportation and for rail transportation in areas which have not yet been electrified, we fast track hydrogen as a motive power for those cars hauling the freighter and indeed passengers in less urban areas. We know that there have been some considerable developments in hydrogen trains from Bombardier and Siemens, and that doesn't look too far away. But the big question, I think, is whether we take a decision that we are going to hydrogenize the rail fleet as far as freight is concerned over the period, or do we try and close those gaps in freight route with electrification?
Okay, thank you for that. I want to put to May's question to you. To what extent do you, as a Shadow BEIS minister, work with your government opposites on sustainable energy generally and hydrogen in particular? And I guess around that as well, it's, is there consensus across the different parties in the political sphere around the need for decarbonisation, that what's happening at COP this year, and then hydrogen in particular?
Yes, I think there's a much higher degree of consensus than there was. I mean, I've spent a long time in Parliament talking to climate change deniers, trying to defend the basics of the route to low carbon and what we need to do in it against a very substantial tide of scepticism across Parliament in recent years. So those people have largely not gone from the parliamentary system, but are actually lying rather low in it. And there is a very high degree of consensus now about the aims and targets and goals. And what we're talking about in rather more detail is not the consensus on the targets and goals, but actually, as I've set out today, the methods by which you get there and what political expenditure and what political priority you're prepared to put into different aspects of that particular goal. And here, I would say excuse me, I try very hard to work as consensually as possible. But I do think it's right when the route is, as I think is the case with blue and green hydrogen, is clearly mistaken that we do call people out on that. So that's a debate that needs to be held, and I hope can be held in a constructive and consensual way, but can also be held, which I've set a great deal of store by, in terms of the science and ensuring that what the Committee on Climate Change is saying and various other people are actually fitted into that dialogue, so that we're not parting from that route. We're just ensuring that the walkabouts within the targets are done in the best possible way.
So unfortunately, we do need to move because we've got a 1 o'clock on international that I want to allow people to go to. But you've just really covered some of the things in the 3 questions that we have here. And if I just refer to them and see if you have any final thoughts for us, because Thomas is asking, what can academia and industry do together? And Thomas comes from an industrial background. Beth's to ensure action rather than promise, and Beth refers to your desire to move back to green hydrogen before we lock into blue, and says, what can we do? And Kath Jackson, again from the industrial sector, asks whether the consultation on low carbon hydrogen standards might be the key to the production problem. So if you maybe just want to finish off by referring to some of those questions, that would be really helpful for us.
Yes, I mean, increasingly, as we deal with the technical aspects of all this, the role of industry and academia really comes to the fore in firstly saying, calling out in the best and possible, most reasonable academic way that can be done, where the political process is clearly straying from what the science tells us, and that the differentiation between how we get there and what we're saying about how we're getting there become really too much to countenance. And so that's one thing I am sure academia will be doing over the next period. Although I would say that needs to be done in the clear understanding that will increasingly look political, but isn't and shouldn't look political in terms of the imperatives that we have in front of us. The question of industry and how that works, well, one of the problems I think that industry itself has, and I've had a lot of conversations with industry, for example, hydrogen electrolyzer producers such as ITM Power and various other things, and they are very concerned from an industrial point of view about how the deployment of hydrogen is going to work out as far as supply chains and industry and so on are concerned. And it is actually something that we have got quite a potential lead on internationally. And whether we throw that away in pursuit of particular political goals that we have as far as doing the cheapest and most apparently easy thing to do over the next period is something I think industry does need to be very concerned about, and indeed is concerned about, and is increasingly putting its point of view to government. But we clearly need to get an alliance between those different areas to actually keep the feet to the fire as far as those specific areas, particular areas are concerned. And certainly if people will allow me to come on that journey with you, then I'd be very happy to take part.
That's brilliant. Thank you for that offer. Tim Mays is very pleased at that, as are several of the rest of us. Yeah, we represent, as you know, Alan, all of the Supergen hubs today, so I'm sure that we will be in contact with you again, particularly in the run-up to COP, where we're going to have a lot more activity around the evidence that has been produced via all of the UKRI funded activities and all of the research that has been going on, which we're trying to use to inform how we move forward on this. So thank you for your time. That has been really, really interesting and useful. And I'm going to encourage everyone to move over to the International Collaboration event, which interestingly the Offshore Renewable Hub are leading on. And we have a number of excellent speakers waiting over there. Thank you.
Thank you.